Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 802, April the 20th, 1987. I'll continue more with about reader vine and accuracy in media in a few weeks. There are just some other matters I wanted to share with you at this time. All of you, of course, saw Amy Carter with Abby Hoffman, either read about it or saw it on television. Their victory against the Central Intelligence Agency for recruiting on the campus, and they're trying to illustrate the problems of the intelligence community, particularly, they said, in Nicaragua. And the judge and the jury were sympathetic to what they were doing. The important point about this young lady's activism is that as she grows, she just can't stop with the CIA or a particular issue. It's very easy for people who are political activists to stick with a particular issue, such as CIA in Nicaragua. In a few years, she's going to have to ask her daddy why he appointed Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor. She may even get a few questions in about Jonestown. And she may ask Jimmy Carter why he accepted $17 million for the Carter Library from Ryosha Sasakawa. The #1 fascist in Japan describes himself as a fascist who throws money around the United States and elsewhere to be respectable, hoping to get the Nobel Peace Prize someday. The issue here is fascism. It isn't a single, it's nice to approach a single issue such as CIA in Nicaragua, but the National Security Council, the NSC, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, or Navy Intelligence, are the agencies to watch, particularly NSC and the DIA, because they give the CIA their orders. And you can't get papers from the Defense Intelligence Agency or the National Security Council. There's no Freedom of Information Act from those people, and they're protected. And then on down, the CIA can be the whipping boy, and it often is, and it isn't perfect. But above them are people even higher who give the orders for the things that the CIA does, and when the CIA is caught, then everyone attacks the CIA. She may even, Amy Carter, want to ask Daddy about the Trilateral Commission and his work with the Trilateral Commission. He was handpicked by them to be the president, an interim president between Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan's presidency. There was a meeting of the Trilateral Group in San Francisco this last month, and of course Henry Kissinger was there. He's a member. Elliot Richardson was there. He is a member. He was Nixon's Secretary of Defense. You remember what went on in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia under Elliot Richardson. And then after he was through with the Vietnam experience, he was heavily involved in Iran and with persons gun running and sending weapons to Khomeni in Iran. Frank Carlucci attended, and he's currently the National Security Advisor for Ronald Reagan, and he played an instrumental part in coups in Portugal and also the dictatorship in 1964 in Brazil that kept that country in a military dictatorship for 22 years. Russell Phillips was at the meeting this year, Executive Vice President of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Michael Kamedisous, Managing Director of IMF. Thomas Labrique, President of Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank. Winston Lord, who's our hand-picked ambassador to Red China, the handpicked by Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer, that clique. Paul Volcker was there, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Caspar Weinberger, Alexander Haig. These are all very active members in the Trilateral Commission that worked with Jimmy Carter. So Amy has taken her first step, or she's crawled that first inch on her knees, and as she grows up and as people in this country grow up, they're going to have to ask questions about these other persons and demand some answers. Now, this is the week where there will be demonstrations and marches in New York, San Francisco, I mentioned them before, Los Angeles, protesting policies of apartheid in South Africa, the United States policies in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, the death squads, and so forth, and a lot of groups will be represented. One of the heroes of the anti-war movement, of the anti-nuclear weapons, the anti-Star Wars, he's very popular and he lectures around the country, is Robert Bowman, Robert M. Bowman, B-O-W-M-A-N. Many of you have heard him. Many of you take his newsletter. He has a newsletter called Space and Security News. and I suggest you send for this letter. Join the group, Volume 4, Number 1, March 1987. I want to share with you a list that he has made for discussing his anti-Star Wars stance and anti-war in general, but anti-Star War in particular, because he's so popular with those persons fighting the weapons system and the space war system. And when I just barely hinted or suggested that Bowman was covering up Fritz Kramer, some loyal fans of his were very angry, or, a little bit outraged, like, he's all we've got, quit knocking him down. So in this last issue that I cited here, I better give you the address if you want to send for it. Many of you have this and some of you don't. 7833 C Street, Chesapeake Beach, Maryland, 20732. And I'll put it on the printed sheet that accompanies this broadcast. And if you want, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me, and I'll give you the address in case I went too fast. But in having parts of the congressional record, his anti-war, anti-Star Wars stance in this newsletter, he's printed a list of names who are the lunatic fringe. He says, we're always getting asked, who are the lunatics behind this anyway? It turns out that a number of core supporters of Star Wars is actually very small, and they're not all lunatics. They are ideologues, spies, charlatans, crooks, and greedy men, probably some very sincere but misguided men, even a few women, very few, with ideological and financial interests that are overlapping. And to our surprise, he said, we keep coming up with the same names and organizations behind arms shipments to Iran and scandals involve spying for Israel, the promotion of Israeli arms merchants, and those interested in the complete report can write for it. The following is a list of the names we keep running across the most often at the top. And he lists these names, and I broke the list down into alphabetical order, and I'm going to read you the names he has, and some you will recognize that I've had on the air. Others I've waited too long to put on the air, have many articles on them, and I'm going to move with those as soon as possible. He has Morris Amite and Abington Corporation. See if these sound familiar to you. Stephen D. Bryen, B-R-Y-E-N. Carl Bendiston. Shoshona Bryen, the wife of Stephen Bryen. Colonel Ralph Bowman. Charles Brooks. Arnaud de Borchgrave. Rudy Boschwitz, the governor of Minnesota. Joseph Coeur. Paul Cutter. Lord Chalfont. Fred Fulner. Howard J. Feldman, Jerry Falwell, Frank Gaffney, Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, Colin Gray, Robert Keith Gray, Jack Hume, Admiral Hayward, Maxwell Hunter, Frank Hober, Max Campbellman, Jack Kemp, Gene Kirkpatrick, David Kemche, Major George Keegan, John Lehman, Michael Ledeen, Barbara Ledeen, Joe Lehman, Christopher Lehman, Colonel William Mott, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, Seymour Weiss, Richard Perle, Eugene Rostow, Richard Mellenscaife, Hal Sonnenfeld, Leon Sloss, William Snyder, Edward Teller, Wilson Talley, Lieutenant General Tisch Jr., General John Voight, William Van Cleve, Richard Vagary, Charles Wick, Albert Wallstetter, and Paul Wyrick. Now, some of those you know, and some I've shared with you on World Watchers, and some you don't know, and there's a few that I don't know. And then he lists the corporations, the crazy lunatics, the Heritage Foundation, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, that's JINSA, the initials JINSA, High Frontier, Abington, Helionetics, Madison Group, Committee on the Present Danger, Hoover Institution of War, Revolution, and Peace, Tamares Limited, Soltam Limited, Establishment Salgad, European Defense Associates, Hertz Foundation, Neuberger and Berman Incorporated, Committee for a Free World, and Council for a National Policy. Now, he describes these as the lunatic fringe, and I'll identify a few for you. But the people he's left out of this, and when he was speaking at the luncheon here, I asked him about this. He's aware of this man. He has for Sven Kramer. I forgot to put that one. That's important. He has Sven, S-V-E-N, Kramer on the list as one of the lunatic fringe. The names he leaves out are Fritz Kramer, the father who's been a lunatic much longer than the son who was a small baby in Nazi Germany, Fred Ickley of the Defense Department, Lord Carrington, who's the head of NATO and helped form Kissinger Associates, Alexander Haig, who along with Kissinger was a protege and is of Fritz Kramer, Lawrence Eagleburger, John McCone, William Buckley, William Simon, Claire Luce, John Singlaub, and Admiral Moore. And I will write to him or call him and talk about these people. Now, the Bryens have been brought up in many articles that I want to share with you and haven't done. Stephen Bryen and Shoshona Bryen of the Defense Department. William Buckley formed Young Americans for Freedom. He has Richard Vagary as important when it was William Buckley and Douglas Caddy that formed YAF and had Ronald Reagan on the board with Charles Willoughby and Robert Morris. He doesn't have Robert Morris, who's one of the absolute most important kingpins of the group. John McCone of the CIA director when Kennedy was killed, when Allende was killed, who's soon to get a Freedom Award from Ronald Reagan. He does not have him, and he's very important. He has put Mr. Sonnenfeld, part of the Kramer-Kissinger-Haig team, on the list, but he left out Lawrence Eagleburger, who was important enough to help Kissinger Associates. He's the president or vice president, a high official in Kissinger Associates, and he's left off Mr. Scowcroft, who was National Security Advisor under Jimmy Carter, who helped John Tower write the report that would protect the NSC. The names that he's left off tell you as much about the list as the ones he has on, because we hear a lot about Michael Ledeen or Barbara Ledeen, but you learn just as much about Claire Luce. She's on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. She's a Knight of Malta. She's on the Committee for Present Danger. She's on John Singlaub's committee. She's in Accuracy in Media. And William Simon is on every one of these groups. The team from Western Goals, Edward Teller, she's listed. He's important, but the people with Edward Teller from Western Goals are equally as important, such as John Singlaub and William Simon. And Robert Morris is important. The real kingpins, I believe, in these operations, and I've said it many times, are Kramer, Ickley, Carrington, currently the president of NATO and co-partner of Kissinger Associates, Haig, Eagleburg, Scowcroft, McCone, Buckley, Simon, Luce, Singlaub, and Admiral Moore. If you're going to put Oliver North, you certainly should have John Singlaub, and it's obvious that neither one of us now have put in the lower echelon, such as Secord and Hakim, or Thomas Kleins or Theodore Shackley. But the list that he has, he calls the lunatic fringe, which is only part of the problem, and the other part is being able to see the whole story. That's why I mentioned Amy Carter should see it, and Mr. Bowman should see it for the whole story, because if you call some of the runts in the litter the lunatic fringe, then who are the people over them? And I mean much over them, such as the ones that are not on this list. There's an article I had, not about a year ago, titled Mole in the Defense Department, Richard Perle Spies for Sharon, and this has to do with the Mossad and our Defense Department working together, and it was published in 1986, just a year ago next week, May the 2nd, 1986. And this one article mentions at least 6 or 7 people in the lunatic fringe that Mr. Bowman has listed, and I want to share this with you, because one of the deepest, darkest secrets of the researchers is the people who say you absolutely can't use anything that the people that write for Lyndon LaRouche publish. And yet I notice that Mr. Bowman, fighting Star Wars and fighting the defense establishment, having once been in it as an officer in the Air Force, is using this material, and we have to ask ourselves, who are those people that say thou shalt not use it? You can't use it or else. Now, there are a team of people that say if you use this material, you are through as a researcher. And I want to do more on that, on sources of information later, maybe next week, on this giving orders. You can't do that. There's 3 people that are doing that presently. One is Sarah Diamond up at KPFA up in the Bay Area, who's writing quite a bit now for Covert Action and other papers. Al Ross in New York and Kevin Coogan in New York. There are 3 of those that say thou shalt not, and they're part of a team just as earlier, around 1967, Sylvia Marr and Harold Weisberg, and not Mark Lane, but Sylvia Marr and Harold Weisberg, and some of the researchers said, thou shalt not talk to Jim Garrison, and thou shalt not read the Torbett document when it came out in 1970. And if you did, those people wrote you off as being somebody that you could not touch or relate to if you used the Torbett document or information that Jim Garrison had in New Orleans. Now that sort of tapered off, and these people turned out later to be working, a lot of them, right in the system that had been criticized as being fascist anyway. Victor Marchetti, incidentally, is now working for Spotlight, giving favorable reviews to a German who says there's no such thing as a Holocaust, and these people didn't die in the concentration camp. And Mark Lane works for Liberty Lobby. And just watch as time evolves. Sylvia Marr is now a screener for books for Simon & Schuster, and they turned down Jim Garrison's book after giving him a deposit on the basis of what she said. So give yourself 8 or 9 years and see where these people go. And just to give you an example of something published in a Lyndon LaRouche newspaper just a year ago, and it's timely because of the thou shalt not whispering campaign that's going on these people, and also because Mr. Bowman is so respected by the people who are anti-Star Wars and anti using the shuttle program for first strike offensive and so forth, and anti-nuclear bombs, people in the system who are against the warfare mechanics that are going on. There's a big movement of those people, and he puts his hit list of lunatics. So I want to share one article with you regarding those names that are used in the story. And this article, as I said, came out in May a year ago. The bustling of the Israeli-Iranian gun-running ring should lead investigators to the offices of Deputy Secretary of Defense Richard Perle, head of Technology Transfer Branch at the Pentagon. Now remember, this was written in May, and Eugene Hassenfuss didn't land until October of '86, and there was no discussion of Iranian gun running by the public until Hassenfuss had landed, and then the story broke about the Iran-Contra connections. This was written before, and the newspaper, the EIR and the New Solidarity, had been publishing articles about gun running to Khomeni going on since 1979. So Richard Perle is mentioned here as sending guns to Iran from the Technology Transfer Branch of the Pentagon. Perle just resigned a week ago officially as a member of the Defense Department, maybe because of his links of the arms to Iran. The article says this news service has already caught Perle attempting to sabotage various commitments of Japan. Perle's swift firing is the signal required from the United States to reassure Japan, contrary to Perle's complications, that Star Wars is a long-term strategic commitment. Now, this article says that Perle was fired in 1986, but he was brought back on the team, of course, and just left, in quotes, voluntarily several weeks ago. The article goes on, Perle is a top member of the ring of high-level operatives of the Israeli Mossad who have infiltrated themselves into key positions in the administration. Not only is Perle an agent for a foreign government, he's linked to a select section of the Israeli Mossad under Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, the same deal that Sharon was making earlier with the Soviet Union, the same nest that controls the illegal arms shipments to Iran. Key to the Sharon deal and with Mr. Perle are the areas of the American high technology that are giving secrets to Israel, and then Israel and the Mossad have been giving them to Moscow in exchange for Soviet Jews being able to settle on the occupied West Bank and Golan Heights. Could Richard Perle knowingly lend himself to such activities? Going back as far as 1970, Perle was caught spying for Israeli. A wiretap on the Israeli embassy in Washington revealed through classified information, and it went to the National Security Council when they ordered the wiretaps, and it was leaked to the press. But he managed to retain his security clearance and post because he was an aide to the late Senator Henry Jackson. And Henry Jackson went down. He died of a heart attack, in quotes, the night after Larry McDonald went down, and Perle, being his protege and aide, then went on to the Defense Department after Jackson died that evening. His death was hardly noticed because of the commotion of the Korean airline. The article continues, JINSA spy nest. Now, Mr. Robert Bowman has JINSA as one of the evil groups around the crazies that are surrounding our Defense Department and our policies in arms to Iran. In 1976, Perle and other top Mossad agents founded an organization called the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, which worked to put operatives in key positions in the United States government. Along with Perle, other members of JINSA was Michael Ledeen. That's the next member that's on the list of Mr. Bowman, who's mentioned this article. Michael Ledeen is a self-avowed universal fascist who worked as a consultant to Alexander Haig, who I say should be on the list, when Haig was Secretary of State. Ledeen is now a consultant to the National Security Council. His wife, Barbara Ledeen, who's also on the list of Mr. Bowman, who, with Meyer Khomeni associate Joseph Churba, works with Joseph Churba, he founded the Center for International Security, is a promoter of the Temple Mount plot to blow up the Muslim shrine in Jerusalem. And I have to do more with you on the plans of certain people in Israel to blow up this shrine. Barbara Ledeen works under Perle in the technology transfer branch. So that's Barbara Ledeen, Michael Ledeen, and Mr. Perle, Richard Perle. Stephen Bryen, this article goes on, he's another member of Mr. Bowman's crazy list, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense working under Perle is in the same branch. From April the 1st, 1978 to April 1st, 79, this is all under Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Bryen was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff. He was also the subject of a Justice Department criminal investigation. He was overheard discussing with the Israeli embassy officials how Israel could retain control of the U.S. Congress. Freedom of Information Act documents reveal that Bryen was considered to be an agent of Zbigniew, then counselor to the Israeli embassy, who also doubled as a Mossad station chief in Washington. The Freedom of Information document says the FBI has good circumstantial evidence that Mr. Raffia, and it's implied that Mr. Raffia had given Mr. Bryen orders which he carried out. Another JINSA racket centered around the Abington Corporation, owned by JINSA. Now, Abington is another organization listed by Mr. Bowman, a very respectable establishment person who on his list cites not only JINSA but Abington Corporation. The owner and head of Abington is John Lehman, another person on the list of Mr. Bowman, and currently Secretary of the Navy. Now, this was written in 1986. In 1987, when the Iran-Contra story began to come apart, and the role of the Mossad and the Israeli intelligence with Jonathan Pollard, and was setting up the arms to Khomeni during the Reagan administration, John Lehman just a few weeks ago resigned from the Navy as Secretary of the Navy, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense Richard Perle resigned. So is it just coincidental that Lehman and Perle resigned at the same time? They're both cited in this article working with Michael Ledeen, Barbara Ledeen, Stephen Bryen, and Mr. Bryan's wife. JINSA Corporation was run by Lehman, current Secretary of the Navy. It employed Richard Perle in the 1970s. Abington struck up a relationship with the Israeli weapons and munitions firm called Soltam, also on the list, advising Soltam how to induce the Pentagon to buy Soltam weapons. Petty corruption is not the issue in the matter of sending arms to Iran. This article goes on. In the summer of 1985, law enforcement agents uncovered an illegal arms ring that was transferring weapons to Iran. Arrested was Wayne Gillespie of the Army Material Command at the Pentagon. Remember, these people were arrested for sending arms to Iran while Ronald Reagan and the National Security Council were sending arms to Iran. Arrested was Gillespie. Also arrested was Farin Senai, a known Iranian arms smuggler, Amir Hosseini, an officer of Khomeni's intelligence service known as the Savama. The ringleader of the operation was Paul Sjeklocha, and his alias is Paul Cutler. That's another name recognized by Robert Bowman as being on the Lunatic Fringe. This is just one more person in just one article. And Paul Cutler lives in Los Gatos, California, and he worked with Cyrus Hashemi, he worked with Albert Hakim, Adnan Khashoggi, and they had been sending weapons to Khomeni for a long, long time. Paul Cutler was arrested along with these other gentlemen, and on the basis of evidence presented August 20th, 1986, Sjeklocha and 6 members of the ring were indicted by a federal grand jury in Orlando, Florida. 1985, pardon me. They were indicted the first time, then they were arrested, another group, in 1986. There were several dozen counts of conspiracy, arms trafficking, and wire fraud. Investigation showed that Sjeklocha, who operated under the cover of the military electronics countermeasures, was connected to the Mossad. In 1982, he went to Israel and met Sharon. The trip was sponsored by Richard Perle and the organization known as JINSA. After he accepted Perle's offer to run guns for Iran, Sjeklocha was put on the board of directors of JINSA. Now, this is one of the many, many articles I have listing Paul Cutler, alias Sjeklocha, or he was born Sjeklocha, Sjeklocha, and I'll be doing a lot more of him, with Stephen Bryen and JINSA and Abington Corporation and John Lehman and Richard Perle and Barbara Ladine and Michael Ladine. And there's a cast of characters that have been weaving in and out of many, many articles. And as I say, there's a team that says you can't use this information or else. And of course, I refuse to take orders from those teams, and they can do all the bad-mouthing. I went through plenty with Mark Lane and Sylvia Marr, and I'm pretty tough, and watch these people go, and 8 or 9 years from now, watch them, because anybody who's so firm that you can't use this material has some reason why you can't use the material. Another article in Executive Intelligence Review, September 13th, 1985, is called Guns for Khomeni, the Mossad Connection. And keep in mind that hardly anybody else except Executive Intelligence Review was writing this kind of story. It says, it goes back to that case I just referred to, July 31st, the federal authorities arrested in Orlando, Florida, a gun-running ring that had equipment of more than $75 million worth of weapons for Khomeni. It was illicit arms smuggling. It involved Paul Cutler, alias Sjeklocha, an Israeli agent since 1982, when he was invited by Defense Minister Ariel Sharon to the Jewish Institute for National Security. Sjeklocha's involvement in illegal weapons to Khomeni's regime implicates sections of the United States Defense Department. Official Dr. Stephen Bryen, the fellow whose name is on the list, one-time director of JINSA, and a board member, together with Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Perle. Joseph Churba, former Mideast desk chief, Air Force intelligence, and personal friend of Defense League founder Meir Kahane. And this plot also involves Georgetown University's Michael Ladine, another Defense Department agent, Shoshana Bryen, the wife of Stephen Bryen. Now, Joseph Churba is somebody whose name I'm going to go into detail next week with you, but I want to bring it in because it's in this one article linking him to this group. Joseph Churba is very close to Robert Morris and Reed Irvine of Accuracy in Media, and the team that wants, in quotes, accuracy in media works very, very close with Fritz Kramer. Churba and Kramer on the board of one of Reverend Moon's institutes, along with some other distinguished people you know. Fritz Kramer is part of this, and Alexander Haig, of course, was played the role of sending the weapons as soon as Ronald Reagan was elected via Israel to continue feeding Khomeni's hunger for weapons to be sent to him even when the Shah was out. Now, there were some persons from Israeli intelligence that were arrested in that original bust going back a couple of years ago. One was General Avraham Bar-Am, a senior Israeli intelligence officer, Israel Eisenberg, age 55, and this group was arrested 1 year later in New York City. There were two large shipments, and this one also involved Joseph Churba and Dr. Saul Lites of the Hudson Institute and Professor Richard Pipes. And remember, Midge Decter of the Accuracy in Media is affiliated with Hudson Institute, as is Edward Teller, and location of the Star Wars bombs and research are located, as he identified several weeks ago, in the Hudson Institute. He moved his agency for official record at the Hudson Institute to do a lot of work with their plans for Star Wars. Now, the Israeli intelligence is closely linked to these areas of the far, far right in this country. Mr. Bowman refers to as the lunatic fringe, but as far as lunatics, they're perfectly normal people running the National Security Council, the Defense Department, and even higher up, as I said before, than the CIA. I'll take a 1-minute break now and continue with some other news that I think is important. In the weeks to come, I'm going to go back to those names in more detail so that you become familiar with them. This is Mae Brussell. It's the second half. This half hour is the second half of World Watchers, program number 802. I got a call on the talk show, part of my program, requesting that I give information about the relocation of the Indians. That was in the news quite a bit in the summer, and we haven't heard much about it. And the person who called wanted me to discuss the companies that were behind the relocation and the necessity for moving them. The Indians up in Flagstaff, the Navajo Hopi Indians, moved them out of their native territory. And so I just wanted to make one comment about it because I did have a broadcast on World Watchers the past summer. There's a book called Global Reach that describes Richard Nixon's activities in Chile and the necessity for Americans to, in quotes, protect American interests. And one reason the government was overthrown in Chile and Allende was murdered was because of companies such as Anaconda Copper, Kennecott Copper, and American multinational corporations that would not want to pay the wages of a labor union to native populations in countries such as Chile. And when you have somebody like Mr. Pinochet in power with a dictatorship, you can pay any price you want. If they don't work, just don't put them to work. The multinationals want profits for their investment, and they're willing to put in the dictators to make sure that those prices stay that way. Now, in 1974, there were plans to move the American Indians that were put into effect in the summer of 1986. In 1974, there was the largest order for relocation in the United States since World War II, when the Japanese were put away in the concentration camps. It was called Public Law 93-531. It involved the final deportation of over 10,000 Navajo people from 1,500 square miles of Hopi partition lands. The Black Mesa, the Four Corners in Arizona, is rich in coal, uranium. Big Mountain is the center of the lands that are to be cleared out, and they're moving these people out. And most of them are going to Flagstaff, Arizona, and cities. They're not used to being in cities. They've been self-sufficient. It will cost taxpayers, it is costing, $1.5 billion to move the Indians out of their lands where they've been for many, many years. And then the profit will be given to the companies that have uranium and coal. We'll pay for their moving, and then the companies can come in. It's like having buildings bulldozed down, and then you come in and take the lots. There are over 23 mining corporations involved. Attorney John Oden, O-Y-D-E-N, who set up the relocation programs, one of the main offices, got $1 million in fee, and he represented both the Indians and the mining company. The largest company recognized is the Peabody Coal. Bechtel Corporation, of which George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger and other cabinet people are involved, and former president and chairman of Bechtel was also John McCone of ITT and CIA. 15% of Peabody is owned by Bechtel Corporation. The board of Peabody includes Stanley Hiller of the Crocker Bank, who supports South African government, David Packard, well known from Hewlett Packard, the Defense Department. He was former Secretary of Defense under Richard Nixon. D.E. Skinner on the board of General Electric. He built the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, and the Fluor Corporation owns 10% of Peabody Coal. That was founded by CIA Director John McCone. The uranium companies involve Kerr-McGee, Mobil, Conoco, United Nuclear, Exxon, and as I say, there are 22 companies. So that maybe answers the question somebody asked me about who was behind the relocation. And it's always, of course, for money. You might know that. And it was. And there are some people that will make quite a bit once the Indians are moved off. I have mentioned Franklin Camper as being under indictment at trial down in Riverside, California. The terrorist who ran a school in Alabama and trained Sikhs, later charged with attempting to murder an Indian who was having medical surgery in Louisiana, and they're linked to the Air India airplane crash and the air bombing that took place. The bomb went off in Japan at the airport. It wasn't up in the air yet. Franklin Camper was found guilty this past week, April 14th, 1987, in the LA Times. And as with stories on Western goals or well-known stories, this didn't make the wire service. It only meant if you live in Los Angeles, it went on the LA Times. The article says a federal grand jury Monday convicted Franklin Camper of firebombing 2 cars after 2 Orange County private school operators hired him. These are nursery and for small children. The teachers do firebombing and hire the notorious Franklin Camper. Camper, 40, owner of Hueytown, Alabama School for Mercenaries, was tried on the same charges. Last fall, a mistrial was declared. The jury was unable to reach a decision. Monday, after a 4-week trial and 3 days of deliberation, they convicted Camper of conspiring, racketeering, using destructive device during a crime. The jury deadlocked on 2 counts of arson, 1 of possessing a destructive device regarding the fire bombings. A Vietnam veteran who claimed to have performed numerous undercover missions for the United States government, which he did for the FBI and the CIA, testified at both trials that his associates destroyed the cars while he was asleep. It's not over yet, Camper said when he left the court. William Hedgeworth, an instructor at Camper's school, was convicted of 4 counts, as was Camper's girlfriend, Leanne Folk. She was acquitted on 5 counts of which she was charged. Federal prosecutors said both Camper and Hedgeworth face at least 10 years, perhaps as long as 35 years in prison. That would be very nice. Let's see if that happens. But being a federal agent, it may be that they want to lock him up because things are getting too hot, and he does connect to a lot of other violences. Now, the last few weeks, I have mentioned the people that have been rounded up who are in jail, who are having trials, the terrorists, terror from the right, which some group or body is going to have to someday say, yes, it's from the right and not from the leftists. At least this is a start. Camper was convicted, and let's see what his sentence is. The sentencing will be pretty soon. The women who hired these gentlemen, they pleaded guilty to conspiracy, and last month one of them was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Well, there goes the nursery school, and the other one's going to be sentenced April 27th. So it'll be interesting to see someday just how many nursery schools could go to Franklin Camper and have him bomb former teachers if they didn't like them. It seemed like a lot of overkill for 2 nursery school teachers. I don't know how it came about, but it did. Now, this is April the 20th, 1987, and I can't help but say happy birthday to Adolf Hitler. He may be still alive. I mentioned about a month ago that a Dr. Robert Dorion, director of the Ministry of Solicitor General of Quebec, presented a paper in Canada about his findings to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences that Hitler's teeth were not identical to the ones of the body found in the bunker, and there have been researchers working on this for years. I seem to be satisfied or settle easily with the news account on CNN News that the Fuhrer died in January 1987 in Mendoza, Argentina. I have a very good friend who's a Hitler watcher. He says that would be too easy, that the Fourth Reich had promised Adolf Hitler on his birthday next year, when he is 100 years old, that they would give him the world. So we'll wait and see if he has the world by then or not. But Mr. Schlickelgruber, whose name was then changed to Alois Hitler, the father, and Adolf Hitler, the son, he had 5 siblings, incidentally. His sister died in 1950. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. Hitler may or may not be alive now, I'm not sure. I think it would be possible to die when you're 98 3/4. The San Francisco Examiner had an article just this last December 31st, a New Year's Eve article. The Axis of World War II takes the UN Council seats. This is the first time since World War II that Japan, Italy, and West Germany became members of the UN Security Council. So Hitler lives in that sense, and Hitler lives in the sense that Mr. Waldheim was able to keep his records locked up in the UN building until he was president of the UN for many years and then president of Austria. There's a new book out by a person, I think these books are totally ridiculous. His name is Dennis Brio, and there's a review, Extraordinary Care, and it's about Adolf Hitler, Elvis Presley, and Howard Hughes, who were impossible patients and had difficulty taking care of them because of their personality quirks. This is just a lot of BS. I'd like to do maybe several broadcasts on Presley and Hitler and certainly Howard Hughes again to show you these are to reinforce the ideas that they almost had a death wish and that's why they were mistreated or their bodies were mistreated, which is part of a series of books, talk about accuracy in media, that are nothing but disinformation. Hitler lives in the sense of those files still locked up in the United Nations that I have talked about the last few weeks, and I think I'll bring up every single week. The files are parked at 345 Park Avenue South in New York City, and there is a list of 36,000 Nazi war criminals, 36,810 there were, and now we know who 3 were, so that's 807. And Hitler lives as long as those names are locked up and protected. And there was an article I mentioned, the Kansas City Times and one the New York Times, titled War Crimes Files Belong to History, and Hitler lives as long as those continue. I cited last week the book by Phyllis Schlafly, the far-right person who wrote a book, Kissing Her on the Couch, and she refers to Fritz Kramer and Dr. William Yandell Elliott and the influences behind Henry Kissinger. Hitler lives, if you don't go into Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger, Dr. Elliott, and Alexander Haig, certainly those 4, Hitler lives. I have many good books on Rudolf Hess, and Hess is going to be released, I understand. He's 92 years old. They're going to let him out of Spandau prison. One book I have is edited by John Rawlings Rees. He helped write it. It's called The Case of Rudolf Hess. And Rees runs the Tavistock Clinic in Great Britain. I often wondered if John Rees was the son of John Rawlings Rees. I never have checked it out. Would you believe that? That's my project for 1987, because John Rees came to this country just at the time John Kennedy was killed, and worked his way right from, he was from Great Britain, and worked his way right from his trip to the United States into the organization known as Western Goals, working for the secretary. Louise Rees married her. John Rees married Louise, and secretary of Senator Joe McCarthy, who released Fritz Kramer out of the Dachau prison in 1946-47. And I wonder if, it's silly to ask so many times, I've got to look up and see if John Rawlings Rees of Tavistock Clinic is related to John Rees of Western Goals, who then went on to work for Carl Spitz Chanell. And the Rees people are associated with covert action, counterintelligence, publishing books with the names of the liberal, the left, for police departments or goon squads to visit your homes and reveal who you are in case they want to do damage to your homes, or in case, I suppose, there's another Crystal Night. Now, John Rawlings Rees wrote the story of Rudolf Hess landing in Scotland in May of 1941, going to the home of Duke of Hamilton, and he brought a letter with him, or letters with him. Rudolf Hess was Hitler's deputy. He was the leader of the Nazi Party. He was a Reich minister without portfolio. He was a member of the Ministerial Council for the Defense of the Reich. He was the secret cabinet counsel for Hitler, and he arrived unannounced in Scotland to the home of Mr. Hamilton. There's another good book I have, the story behind Hess's flight to Britain, and I'll share more of that with you in a week or two, but his trip was so secret that Winston Churchill and the British government refused to discuss it, and Rudolf Hess was put in the hands of 7 American psychiatrists, American and British, and they could do a good job on him between 1941 and 1945. When he stood trial at the Nuremberg trials, he was, of course, given the sentence that put him in Spandau prison for the rest of his life, but while at Spandau, he didn't see his wife or his son for 28 years, and there's a lot of reason to believe that the man there was substituted once he was through with the trial, and that the real Rudolf Hess was allowed to leave. And if he was allowed to leave, he set up with Martin Bormann all the South American contacts and with Otto Skorzeny that they would need to turn over the Reich to Adolf Hitler on his 100th birthday. The magazine Gung Ho in 1986, August 86, had an article about Rudolf Hess, and it tells about his speaking with Speer when they were at Spandau prison together before Albert Speer was released. And the article says, what is certain is that Rudolf Hess, like G. Gordon Liddy of a later era, never lost faith in his master or recanted. As he told Colonel Byrd decades after 1941, I would not have missed the opportunity of serving under Adolf Hitler as his deputy. I was a dedicated man. The figure of the Fuhrer will stand like a beacon over the centuries, and he will be honored as one of the greatest pathfinders and benefactors of mankind. G. Gordon Liddy is moving some headquarters for his international snooping, or whatever you want to call it, up to Silicon Valley, which is very dangerous considering that Mr. Reed Irvine has targeted that area as being important. And the news from David Emery and Nip Tuck, and he hasn't mentioned Mae Brussell, but I'm sure they know, because over that radio station, putting G. Gordon Liddy up there in Silicon Valley is really dangerous. And Oliver North follows this same line. The people he works with have the same principle. You don't have to worry about that. And Adolf Hitler lives in the White House, the Oval Office of Ronald Reagan. There was an article in the Miami Herald about John Kohler, the member of the Hitler Youth, who was turned down as a communications director of the White House. And the title of the article was March the 11th, 1987, Aide's exit called a blow to Reagan, seen as a setback to a strong image. And the gist of the article is that in the rare departure from normal when the White House hired Kohler, he had been personally endorsed for the job by the president, by Nancy Reagan, by Charles Z. Wick, and Robert Bowman has Wick on that lunatic Fringe, you know. It was unusual to remove him from his job when they found out he was part of Hitler Youth. And the article says from the Miami Herald that the White House was disappointed because if they had John Kohler there, Ronald Reagan would have a strong image. Well, that's identical to Ronald Reagan going to Bitburg, standing at the graves of the Waffen-SS and projecting to the world that you are forgiven. Hitler was probably right in doing what he did, and I'm going to recognize you young people dying for a cause. That's the mentality of Hess, of Liddy, of Oliver North, and the White House, according to this story, was disappointed because we have a very image-conscious president, and it bothered him that a person of the Hitler Youth couldn't give the president a strong image. He wanted a stronger image by having John Kohler there as communication director of the White House. And Hitler lives, of course, in the Wall Street Journal just today, April 20th. The United States will now begin gene-altered animal patents. It cites a certain company that already had been experimenting on animals, and by genetically altering them, they put some rabbit genes into a rat and grew a giant rat. So as of now, outside the laboratory, in the animal laboratory, the animals will be experimented, all animals other than humans. This was started by Embragene under the aegis of Ohio State University, Ohio State's Edison Animal Biotechnology Center. The center director is Thomas Wagner, who is one of the scientists who inserted the rabbit gene to get the huge giant mouse. So as of this point, they can start altering animals. And I understand in Japan, they're already getting a genetically altered hepatitis vaccine in silkworms and using silkworms to clear these matters. And as far as chemical and food altering, I have many articles. I should be doing one of those a week for you to update you on these. The Wall Street Journal today said court clears the delay of a ban on tainted mango imports. And the gist of the article is the Environmental Protection Agency wanted to stop mangoes with pesticide that could cause cancer. But the Environmental Protection Agency says we won't stop them coming in this country till after September the 30th because the State Department wants to soften the impact. The mangoes are grown in Mexico, Haiti, Belize, and Guatemala. And the EPA, is objecting to the State Department. They said the first interest should be to protect American citizens, not foreign policy. And the State Department said, we will consider foreign policy. They can send them until they figure out what to do as far as selling their products, probably to third world countries. I consider us a third world country. They're sending us those foods. So the State Department wins that we can get mangoes until September 30th from countries using pesticides that could cause cancer. Also, the Environmental Protection Agency eased the restriction in Portland, Oregon. The judge said that they can use Dinoseb, which is a pesticide that causes birth defects and sterility. And this is dangerous. It says on green peas, snap beans, cucurbits, and cannaberries in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, that they can put this on the food. It affects the health and safety of farmers, families, and unborn children. The EPA protested a court order easing the ban. It goes on to say the EPA has allowed the chemical use on dry peas, lentils, and chickpeas in parts of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So what you're getting is a chemical, Dinoseb, in this case herbicide, that can cause sterility and birth defects. Keep in mind the vegetarians. I'm a vegetarian. A source of protein, a good source of protein in these matters is dry peas, lentils, and chickpeas. And the EPA says, yeah, you can put this chemical, if I'm reading it properly, Dinoseb, they've eased it on these particular foods, and the purpose of being a vegetarian is to get away from the kinds of things that are put into meats and animals. That's my reason. The article goes on to say last year, 7 to 11 million pounds of this chemical, this herbicide, Dinoseb is a herbicide and serves as a fungicide and an insecticide. 7 to 11 million pounds were sold annually for quite a few years by 80 companies, including Uniroyal Chemical Company, a unit of Uniroyal Cedar Chemical Corporation, the U.S. unit of Host AG of West Germany. West Germany sending a insecticide to this country, making an insecticide that causes sterility and damage to birth defects to affecting unborn children, coming into beans and food products that vegetarians eat in dry peas, chickpeas, and so forth. Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, I think, in a sense, Hitler lives. Now, for the shocker of articles, I get so many every day, but this is one of the top ones, and I shouldn't have saved it to the last, but I'll see if I can get it all in this time period, and I'll get the full story from a world watcher in New York. I called him today out of Newsday. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle, and listen to this story. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's private arms network purchased 158 tons of rifles and ammunition for Nicaraguan rebels last year. He bought them from a reputed international narcotic smuggler and a terrorist linked to the hijackers of the liner Achille Lauro. Sources said it was printed in Newsday. Now, Michael Ledeen and Bettino Craxi, the Prime Minister of Italy, were involved in the Achille Lauro whole story that was going on at the time, as was Oliver North. And North was buying from a narcotic smuggler, a terrorist, linked to the Achille Lauro. The sources identified the arms dealer as Monzer Al-Kassar, a 42-year-old Syrian who reportedly supplied arms to Abbas, the head of the Palestine Liberation Front unit, the mastermind of 1985 Achille Lauro hijacking and other radical Palestinian groups. Now, Abbas was arrested in Italy after the hijacking of Achille Lauro, and the plane was directed by Oliver North and delivered to Bettino Craxi. Bettino Craxi released Abbas, who was obviously working with North, and he was able to leave Italy and was not held in a trial. They found him guilty, of course, but they released him in Italy, and he is out at large, and he was, in fact, working with Oliver North and was the man behind the Achille Lauro hijacking, which I realized was a setup right from the very beginning, an agent provocateur action. Now, to continue with this article, the arms were purchased by a company linked to retired Air Force Major General Richard C. Cordigan and his business associate Albert Hakim. That comes out of Stanford Technology, the IIS, the beginning of the TCI, the Otto von Bolschwing network Of course, Secord and Hakim were involved with Abbas. The arms were purchased from him, the man arrested for masterminding the Klinghoffer murder, the dumping of him in the wheelchair into the ocean. The whole Achille Laura episode comes right out of Oliver North, Secord, and Hakim. Both men have figured prominently in the Iran-Contra scandal. It goes on. The purchase of the arms from Al-Kassar was confirmed. Imagine, these are arms going to Nicaragua from a man who masterminded the Achille Laura. They're giving him business and money, probably paying him 10 times the price of the arms to pay off for the Achille Laura story. The purchase of the arms from Al-Kassar was confirmed by congressional investigators probing the Iran-Contra affair. Wow. A retired intelligence officer said that Al-Kassar family, which includes several brothers, is reputed to be the largest drug and arms dealing family in Syria. Now watch that link to Henry Arsan and the Steve Baum operation out of the Vatican, out of Banco Ambrosiano, that links to Arsan and the Syrian connections, and because these same operatives all worked as a team, and the names keep running in and out of each one of these affairs. The article goes on. A United States criminal record document labels him, Al-Kassar, and the family, of course, and this great terrorist, Abbas, with a large capital letter terrorist at the top of the page. It claims he has alleged ties to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, controlled by Dr. George Habash. Now go back to the article I did for Hustler magazine in February 1984, where there's a picture of Larry McDonald in the center, and I designed a Larry McDonald pie with 7 parts to show you the importance of Western Goals under the persona of Larry McDonald. Then Western Goals was turned over to Carl Spitz Chanell in Washington, and 5 members of the board of Western Goals are on the board of Accuracy and Media, and Carl Spitz Chanell, of course, is directly linked with Oliver North and John Singlaub, one of those members of Western Goals. And one piece of the pie, I referred to Robert Byron Watson's affidavit to the House Select Committee on Assassinations involving the murders of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and the name of George Habash from Lebanon, the Atlanta, Georgia connections to the assassination, and his brother Fuad Habash are the links to ITT, to Colonia Dignidad, to General Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and the Nazi connections in Chile. Habash is part of this story. The sources familiar with the transaction said that Al-Kassar acted as the middleman for the deal. He purchased the arms, now listen to this, from Senzin, C-E-N-Z-I-N, the Polish government agency that controls foreign trade, and sold them to North's group. Now I have about 5 different Polish or Eastern European arms agencies that are sending like weapons, Soviet weapons, Eastern weapons, down to Central America and all over the world. So when they're found, like with the Achille Laura, in one newspaper they refer to a Soviet-made AK-47 assault rifle. That was in the Houston Post, June 24th, 1986, at the time of the trial. They sell the Soviet weapons and leave them so that when Mr. Klinghoffer is dead, you see Soviet weapons, and they're being sent out of Poland from this group, the Senzin group. Details of buying and selling prices and financial arrangements cannot be learned, but this is a story that just broke. When the trial was going on for these particular terrorists, I have many articles on them, one from the San Francisco Chronicle, June 20th, and it tells about a man, one of the defendants in this trial, a defiant person who confessed to murdering a disabled New York City man during the Achille Laura crime. He was his name is Yosef Magid Al-Molki, M-O-L-Q-I. I'm sure I didn't pronounce it right, but Molki said at first he said he did the murders, but he repeatedly told the judge that neither he nor the other 3 hijackers committed the murder. They insisted Klinghoffer's death was a game between the Syrians and the Americans. This echoed statements by Mohammed Abul Abbas, and that's the man who works with Oliver North getting weapons down to Nicaragua and through this operation, and also was the man behind the Achille Laura. This statement was echoed by Mohammed Abul Abbas, the leader of the PIA, Palestine Liberation Organization, who was accused of having ordered and directed the hijacking. Abbas has maintained that Klinghoffer died of natural causes. His body was taken to Syria after the hijacking. Later, the autopsy showed that there were gunshots to the chest and head. But the defendant, Mr. Moltke, was saying that it was his death, Klinghoffer's death, was a game between the Syrians and the Americans. Another article in the Houston Post, besides the fact of the assault weapon being a Russian weapon, goes into the death of Mr. Klinghoffer and how he was wheeled over to the terrace by a Portuguese steward. And I wonder, because of the strong links of William Casey and Richard Allen and Frank Carlucci and Oliver North and Singlao bin Hakim shipping weapons to Central America through Portugal, if this wasn't just one other witness or person just happening to be on the ship who delivers the wheelchair and the gentleman to the people who were to shoot him and throw him over the side. The New York Times, July the 11th, has another article that Mr. Moltke and his 3 defendants were arrested in Sicily after an Egyptian airline carrying them from Cairo was forced to land by United States Navy planes. That was the Oliver North operation. And then the article goes on to say that Mr. Abbas and his colleagues then were released and set free. The Italian government let them go free. His colleagues were taken out of Italy, and of course there was quite a bit of complaint about it. It lasted all of about 2 hours and was ignored, and Abbas and his deputies, even though they were found guilty, they're not in the country at all, in Italy, and they fled elsewhere. And they referred to the fact that this whole hijacking was what they were a political ploy. And it's interesting, the terms that they use, as if they're doing it for America. My time is running out, so I can't do more. I'll do more on Oliver North and the hijacking and Bettino, Craxi, and Michael Ledeen, hopefully next week. In the meantime, not enough time. We'll have to get back to it next week. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be sharing these and other facts with you and World Watchers. And thanks again for all the books and articles you've been sending.